Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our first read aloud of Flush by Carl Hiaasen. Again, I don't know if that's how you say it, but speaking in karate language, I feel like that's probably the best way to say his name. Hiaasen. Yeah. Anyway, let's get serious. We've got Diego and Otter, who have decided to stay close to the fire. It's still just a little chilly this morning. And I am drinking coffee. And as we start our new book, I always like to figure out what the book is about. And this book says, Noah's dad has a little problem with anger control. He tried to stop the Carol Queen Casino's boat illegal dumping by sinking the boat, but his bold protest fizzles. Within days, the casino is back in business, and Noah's dad is behind bars and out of action in jail. Now, Noah is determined to succeed where his father failed, but even though pumping raw sewage into the waters of the Florida Keys is both gross and against the law, turns out it's near impossible to catch the flusher, especially when the flusher has already bamboozled the prosecutors, the local press, and even the Coast Guard. But Noah's got a few allies of his own. There's his little sister, Abby, an underformed childhood biter, life-peaking, a half-spoused ex-mate of the Carol Queen who is willing to testify and for a piece, and Shelley, a big-hearted bartender with even bigger biceps. Okay, so we've got his little sister, Abby, who's an unreformed childhood biter. We've got Lice Peking, who's a half-soused ex-mate of the Carol Queen, so he's an old employee of Carol Queen who was willing to go and testify in court against him for a price, wants money, and Shelley, who's a big-hearted bartender with even bigger biceps. Okay, so the odds aren't good, but Noah has an ace up his sleeve. A plan so crazy it just might stop the polluting, save the beaches, and prove to the world that it's the owner of Carol Queen and not his dad who is full of crud, which is a gross substance. Okay, so a very interesting intro to what the book is going to be about. Let's meet our characters, or at least one of them. Chapter 1. The deputy told me to empty my pockets. 2 quarters, a penny, a stick of bubble gum, and a roll of grip tape for my skateboard. Pitiful. Go on inside, he's waiting for you, the deputy said. My dad was sitting alone at a bare metal table. He looked pretty good, all things considered. He wasn't even handcuffed. Happy Father's Day, I said. Wow, visiting your father in prison on Father's Day. This kid's got to have some sort of a story. He stood up and gave me a hug. Thanks, Noah, he said. In the room, there was another deputy, a broad, jolly bear standing next to the door that led to the jail cells. I guess his job was to make sure I wasn't smuggling a hacksaw to my father so he could cut his way out. It's good that they let you keep your own clothes, I said to Dad. I figured they'd make you put on one of those dorky uniforms. I'm sure they will, sooner or later, he shrugged. You doing okay? How come you won't let Mom bail you out, I asked. Because it's important for me to be here, right now. Important? How? She says you'll lose your job if you stay locked up. She's probably right, my dad admitted. He's been driving a taxi for the past year and a half. Before that, he was a fishing guide, a good one too, until the Coast Guard took away his captain's license. He said, Noah, it's not like I robbed a bank or something. I know, Dad. Did you see what I did? Not yet, I said. He gave me a wink. It's impressive. Yeah, I bet. He was in a surprisingly good mood. I'd never been to a jail before. Oh, I guess I misspoke. He's in jail, not prison. Kind of a small difference. Though, honestly, it wasn't much of a jail. 2 holding cells, my dad told me. The main county lockup was miles away in Key West. Mom wants to know if she should call the lawyer, I said. I suppose. The same one from last time? She wasn't sure. Yeah, he's all right, my father said. Okay, so it's not his first time in jail. And from the intro, we know he blew up a casino boat. I'm assuming nobody was on it, nobody got hurt, but let's read on. His clothes were rumpled and he looked tired, but he said the food was decent and the police were treating him very nice. Dad, what if you just said you're sorry and offered to pay for what you did? But I'm not sorry for what I did, Noah. The only thing I'm sorry about is that you've got to see me locked up like some sort of axe murderer when I'm not like that at all. The other times my dad had gotten in trouble, they wouldn't let me come to the jail because I was too young. I'm not a common criminal. Dad reached across and put a hand on my arm. I know right from wrong, good from bad. Sometimes, well, I get carried away doing what I think is right. Nobody thinks you're a criminal, Dad. Dusty Molman sure does. That's because you sunk his boat, I pointed out. If you just paid to get it fixed, maybe then... That's a 73-footer, my dad cut in. You gotta know what you're doing to sink one of those pigs. You ought to have a look. Maybe later, I said. The deputy standing by the door made a grunting noise and held up 5 chubby fingers, which was the number of minutes left before he took my father back to the cell. Is your mom still ticked off at me? Dad asked. Well, what do you think? I tried to explain it to her, but she wouldn't listen. Then maybe you can explain it to me, I said. I'm old enough to understand. Dad smiled. I believe you are, Noah. Okay, so there's a pause in the story here. So we're being introduced to Noah and his father. His father sunk a boat because he thought that they were doing something wrong or he was standing up for what was right. But blowing up a boat seems like it's not the best course of action. Well, let's read on. My father was born and raised here in Florida, so he grew up on the water. His dad, my grandpa Bobby, ran a charter boat out of Haulover Marina on Miami Beach. Grandpa Bobby passed away when I was little, so I honestly didn't remember him. We'd heard different stories about what happened. One was that his appendix burst, another was that he got in a real bad bar fight. All we know for sure is that he took his fishing boat down to South America on some sort of job, but never returned. One day, a man from the U.S. State Department showed up at the house and told me and my parents that Grandpa Bobby was dead and buried near some little village in Colombia. For some reason, they couldn't bring his body home for a funeral. I knew this because I'd seen the paperwork. My dad kept a file. At least 4 or 5 times a year, he would write to Washington, D.C., asking someone to please help get his father's coffin back to Florida. This is like 10 years later. My mom worked with my dad on the letters. She's a legal secretary, and she gets straight to the point. My mom and dad first met while they were standing in line to pay speeding tickets at the Dade County Courthouse. And they got married 6 weeks later. I know this for a fact because, well, Mom put the speeding tickets in a scrapbook along with their wedding pictures and stuff like that. The ticket my mother got was for driving 44 miles an hour in a 35 mile an hour zone. My father's ticket was much worse. He was doing 93 miles an hour on the turnpike. In the album, Dad's ticket looked sort of lumpy and wrinkled because he crumpled it into a ball when the state trooper handed it to him. My mother said she used a laundry iron to flatten it out before pasting it next to hers in the scrapbook. About a year after they got married, my parents moved down to the Keys. I'm sure this was Dad's idea because he'd been coming here ever since he was a kid and he hated the big city. I was actually born in 1989, Chevrolet Caprice on US Highway 1. My dad racing up the 18-mile stretch from Key Largo to the mainland. He was trying to get my mother to the hospital in Homestead. She was lying in the backseat of the car, and that's where I was born. Mom did it all by herself. She didn't tell my dad to pull over and stop because she didn't want him interfering. They still argue about this. She says he's got a tendency to get overexcited, which is an understatement. He didn't even realize I was born until they got to the Florida city, and I started bawling. Abby came along 3 years later. Dad talked Mom into naming her after one of his favorite writers, some weird old bird who's buried out west in the middle of a desert. Wonder if I can figure out who that is. I bet you it's a real person. Most of my friends aren't crazy about their sisters, but Abby's alright. Maybe it's not cool to say so, but the truth is, she's funny, tough, not nearly as irritating as most of the girls at school. Over the years, Abby and I have developed a pretty good system. She keeps an eye on Mom, and I keep an eye on Dad. Sometimes, though, I need extra help. So, what's the deal? Abby asked after I got back from the jail. We were sitting at the kitchen table. For lunch, Mom had fixed us the usual, ham and cheese sandwiches. He says he got carried away again, I said. Abby raised her eyebrows and snorted. No duh. Mom set 2 glasses of milk on the table. Noah, why does he insist on staying in jail? It's Father's Day. I guess he's trying to make a point? All he's making, my sister said, is a mockery of himself. Hush, Abby, Mother told her. He said it's okay to call the lawyer, I added. He's not pleading guilty. Abby asked, how can he not plead guilty? He did it, didn't he? It's still smart to have an attorney, said my mother. She seemed much calmer now. When the police first called, she'd gotten real mad and said some pretty harsh things about Dad. Honestly, I couldn't blame her. Even for him, this was a major mess-up. "Noah, how you doing?" she asked. I knew she was worried about the jailhouse visit, if it had shaken me up or anything, so I told her I was fine. She said, "I'm sure it wasn't easy seeing your father behind bars." "They brought him to a private room," I said. "He wasn't even wearing handcuffs." My mother frowned slightly. "Still, it's not a happy picture." Abby said, "Maybe he ought to plead insanity." Mom ignored her. "Your father has many good qualities," she said to me, "but he's not the most stable role model for a young man like yourself. He'd be the first to admit it, Noah." Whenever I get this speech, I listen patiently and I don't say a word. She won't come right out and say so, but Mom worries that I'm too much like my dad. "Drink your milk," she said, and then she went to the den to call our lawyer, a man named Mr. Shine. As soon as we were alone, Abby reached over and twisted the hair on my arms. "Tell me everything," she said. "Not now," I jerked my head toward the doorway. "Not with Mom around." Abby said, "It's all right, she's on the phone." I shook my head firmly and took one bite of my sandwich. "Noah, are you holding out on me?" my sister asked. "Finish your lunch," I said, "then we'll go for a ride." Okay, there's another pause in the story. Interesting family dynamics already. I like how Noah and Abby are friends, even though they're brother and sister, which is sometimes hard, especially with a 3-year difference. I know most of you feel the same way. I like how different the mom and the dad are. It's kind of like my wife and I. We're very different people. Not in the same way as these two characters, but we're very different. We kind of complete each other. I feel like mom and dad in this book are going to be kind of the same way. But let's read on and kind of figure out what's going on here. The Coral Queen had gone down stern first, in 12 feet of water. Her hull had settled on the Marley bottom, a slight angle with the bow aiming upward. The bow aiming upward. It's a boat term. I think the bow is the back of the ship. She was a big one, too. Even at high tide, the top 2 decks were above the waterline. It was a big, ugly apartment building that had fallen out of the sky and landed in the basin. Abby hopped off my handlebars and walked to the water's edge. She planted her hands on her hips and stared at the crime scene. "Whoa," she said. "He really did it this time." "It's bad," I agreed. The Coral Queen was one of those gambling boats where passengers line up to play blackjack and electronic poker and to stuff their faces at the all-you-can-eat buffet. It didn't sound like a ton of fun to me, but the Coral Queen was always packed to the rafters, every night. There was one major difference between Dusty Moleman's operation and the gambling cruises up in Miami. The Coral Queen didn't actually go anywhere. That's one reason it was so popular. By Florida law, gambling boats are supposed to travel at least 3 miles offshore, beyond the state boundaries, so they're not technically in Florida anymore, before anyone's allowed to start betting. Rough weather is real bad for business because lots of customers get seasick. As soon as they start vomiting, they quit spending money. According to my father, Dusty Muleman's dream was to open a gambling boat that never left the calm and safety of its harbor. That way the passengers would never get too queasy. They could keep partying and betting and spending money. Only Indian tribes are allowed to run casino operations in Florida, so Dusty somehow persuaded a couple of rich Mikosikis from Miami to buy the marina and make it part of their reservation. Dad said the government raised a stink, but later backed off because the Indians had better lawyers. Anyways, Dusty got his gambling boat, and he got rich. My dad had waited until 3 in the morning, when the last of the crew was gone, to sneak aboard. He untied the ropes and started one of the engines and idled out to the mouth of the basin, where he opened the seacocks and cut the hose and disconnected the bilge pumps and then dived overboard. The Coral Queen had gone down crosswise in the channel, which meant that no other vessel could get in or out of the basin. In other words, Dusty Muleman wasn't the only captain in town who wanted to strangle my dad on Father's Day. I locked my bike to a buttonwood tree and walked down to the charter docks, Abby trailing behind me. 2 small skiffs and a Coast Guard inflatable were nosing around the Coral Queen. We could hear the men on the skiffs talking about what had to be done to float the boat. It was a major project. "He's lost his marbles," Abby muttered. "Who, Dad?" "No way," I said. "Then why did he do it?" "Well, because Dusty Muleman has been dumping his holding tank in the water," I said. Abby grimaced. "Yuck. From the toilets?" "Yep, in the middle of the night, when there's nobody around." "Oh, it's so gross." "And totally illegal," I said. "He only does it to save money." According to my father, Dusty Muleman was such a pathetic cheapskate that he wouldn't even pay to have the Coral Queen's sewage hauled away. Instead, his crew standing orders to flush the waste into the basement, which is already murky. The tide later carried most of the filth out to open water. But why didn't Dad just call the Coast Guard? My sister asked. Wouldn't that have been the grown-up thing to do? He told me he tried. He said he called everybody he could think of, but they could never catch Dusty in the act. Dad thinks somebody's tipping them off. Oh, please, Abby groaned. Now she was starting to annoy me. When the wind and the current are right, the poop from the gambling boat floats out of the basin and down the shoreline, I said, straight to Thunder Beach. You. Abby made a pukey face. Ugh. So that's why they close the park sometimes. You know how many kids go swimming there? What Dusty's doing can make you get real sick at both ends. Hospital sick, Dad says, so it's not only disgusting, it's actually really dangerous. Yeah, but I didn't say it was right, Abby, what Dad did. I'm only telling you why he did it. My father hadn't even tried to get away. After swimming back to the dock, he sat down in a folding chair, opened a can of root beer, and he watched the Coral Queen go down. He was still there at dawn, sleeping when the police arrived. So what now? Abby asked. A dark bluish slick surrounded the boat, and the men in the Coast Guard inflatable were laying out yellow floating bumpers to keep the oil and grease from spreading. By sinking the Coral Queen, my father himself had managed to make quite a mess. I said, Dad asked me to help him. Abby made a face. Help him what? Break out of jail? Oh, get serious, Abby. Then what, Noah? Tell me. I knew she wasn't going to like it. Well, he wants me to help nail Dusty Muleman, I said. A long silence followed, so I figured Abby was thinking up something snarky to say, but it turned out that she wasn't. I didn't give Dad an answer yet, I said. I already know your answer, said my sister. His heart's in the right place, Abby. It really is. It's not his heart I'm worried about. It's his brain, she said. You better be careful, Noah. Are you going to tell Mom? I don't know. I haven't decided yet. She gave me a sideways look that told me she probably wouldn't. Like I said, my sister's all right. And that's where they end chapter 1. So, very interesting dynamics. Sounds like this Dusty Muleman is really doing some shady business just to try and save a few bucks, but he's putting gross stuff into the water and hazardous stuff into the water so people could get really sick. So they're having to close down a beach so people don't get sick from it, and it's causing a lot of problems, and it's probably costing the city a lot of money to clean it up. But then again, I don't agree with Noah's dad's approach to taking care of the situation. I know he initially tried to talk to people and convince them something was going on, but he thinks they're being paid off. But sinking the boat, like they just said, it put a lot of other dangerous materials into the water, such as oil and gasoline. And that's not good for the wildlife in the water or the people swimming around there. So I'm kind of torn. I'm not sure whether I want to root for Noah's dad or if I want to root against him. I know his heart's in the right place, but again, he really approached it, I think, in the worst way possible. But we'll figure out where the story goes tomorrow. I'll see you then.